All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's After the Bell event with Dr. Shamira Gelbman from our Political Science Department at Wabash. My name is Emily Bettany, and I work in advancement here on campus, and I'm so excited to see some new and some familiar faces joining us tonight. I will just have a quick introduction, and then I will turn it over to our guest tonight. Dr. Gelbman has been with us since 2012 in the political science department. She teaches on American politics, but also sometimes bodybuilding and other interdisciplinary courses that cover topics like the civil rights movement, immigration policy, and Wabash's political history, which is what we'll talk about a little bit tonight. Her primary research focuses on interest groups and social movement organizations in American politics. She comes to us from Brooklyn, New York, with degrees from the City University of New York and from University of Virginia. So Professor Gelbman, we are so grateful to have you here with us tonight. I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Emily, and thank you everyone for turning out tonight. It's great to see such a crowd. And yes, it's a topic that's probably of interest to many, if not all, alumni. And this is a course I taught called Governing Wabash. I taught this course in the spring of 2022, so about a year ago. It feels a little longer. And so I taught it then, and thinking about teaching it again, something I'll talk about a little bit later on in the presentation. I thought I would start by, let's see if this will work. Thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about who I am. You got kind of a formal introduction from Emily. And so you heard that I do research on interest groups, lobbying in particular, specifically public interest lobbying, especially for civil rights legislation. So about 2 years ago, my book, The Civil Rights Lobby, came out. You see the number 19 here on the screen. I just counted up the other day. I've taught 19 different courses since I got to Wabash a little over a decade ago, which is a lot. And I think both the kind of research I do, which involves spending a lot of time in archives, just going through old papers, and then when I find something that's interesting, I just chase after it. I think that and my 19 courses, most of which have been special topics that I've kind of dived into for a bit and then moved on from, have kind of speak to this, just my general temperament, I think, as a person and as a faculty member. And that is kind of like Alice in Wonderland, stumbling onto a rabbit hole, and then finding interesting things along the way and chasing them as far as I feel like running. So this course, Governing Wabash, kind of took shape in that way. So it's an idea for a course that I'd been kicking around for several years before 2022. In many of my American politics classes at all levels and of all kinds, I find myself kind of looking to Wabash's political dynamics and governing practices for analogies to help students kind of make sense of stuff or relate to some political processes more than they would just by hearing about it more textbook style. And just to take one example, those of you who've graduated very recently may have participated in a redistricting of the campus activity in Introductory American Politics Political Science 111, where we basically say if we were to kind of redo student government here and say, well, we're going to have 6 districts on campus, each one has to have an equal population. How do we start thinking about grouping different houses and living units together, breaking some up? What does that do for the outcomes of any elections we might have consequently? So this is something I've been doing for a while. And then in 2019 or so, when I got back from sabbatical, some students approached me. They were all kind of involved in student government, and the year before they'd been running for election. And they said, oh, we took what we learned about voter turnout in the Intro to American Politics and used that to try to drive up voter turnout in Wabash student government elections. And I spent the next, 6 months with those guys working on an independent study to try to learn more about voter turnout in student government elections, both at Wabash and beyond, and kind of write up a formal political science conference paper that they presented to the Southern Political Science Association based on that experience. And so at that point, this idea for just kind of developing a whole course that would think about the politics and government of Wabash seemed even more like a realistic and a kind of an ideal way to approach sort of an entry-level study of government and politics. And then finally, right around that same time, the college got some grant money to sponsor a pretty large number of faculty fellowships called Equity and Inclusion Pedagogy Fellowships, where you are given either a course release or some money or a course release to use at a future time to either develop a new course or overhaul an old course with an eye towards thinking about themes of equity and inclusion. And it seemed to me that thinking about those themes right in your own backyard seemed like a really good place to start. And so I applied for one of those fellowships to design a course called Governing Wabash. Got it, spent a summer and some months working on it, and then kind of ran it for the first time in the spring of 2022. With the history department chair's agreement, we ran this course as a cross-listed history and political science course. And so instead of focusing just on the dynamics of how Wabash operates today, we kind of took the full history of the college as kind of our fodder for the course and just ran with that in many different directions. So what I'll do the rest of my time today is talk a little bit about the course broadly, but then run through kind of how it worked, some of the topics we covered. I'm not going to talk about everything because that could go on for a while. And then I'll wrap up by talking just a little bit about what I learned and what I'm thinking about doing next with this. I do think it's a course I want to keep teaching. The first experience was a pretty good one. So I think when I think about the government and politics of a small place like a college campus, and maybe especially the Wabash College campus, the concept that seems very central, well, one concept that seems central that we used a lot in the class was hyperlocal politics. We talk about local politics and we mean cities, counties, right? Hyperlocal politics is when you get kind of even smaller scale than that and look at something like a campus or a homeowners association or something like that. So hyperlocal politics, but I think the real central concept to me quickly became the idea of community, right? If you read the description for tonight's session, this idea of community is kind of the central theme of how I described the course to you all and how I thought about it when I started developing it and describing it for students and colleagues here on campus. And so before I dive into kind of where I ran with that, if you all wouldn't mind taking just a minute, and when you think of the word community, in the chat, just kind of free association, what other words come to mind? So think of community, what else does it make you think of? What ideas or concepts? I'll give you a minute to, okay.
All right, we've got involvement, the town where I live, collaboration, shared ideas, tribe, neighborhood, friendship, connection, sharing, community relating to commonality of people and values, small knit group with common factors, shared environment and shared responsibility, understanding.
Yeah, these are great. And I think they're ideas that when you think of community, I think we tend to reach for, in some ways, what we might say the positives, right? The people all getting along, working it out, living in a kind of a close-knit setting. They have a lot of commonality. They cooperate a lot. They get involved. As a political scientist, I love this, and this is the community I think we strive for, right? If we think about what's the good community, it's a community that embodies all of these characteristics. But I think also as a political scientist, I kind of end up going in a different direction. So one concept that kind of jumps out at me right away when I think of community is this idea of governance, right? That communities, they can kind of just exist, but usually they need some coordinated decision making to kind of make things move along, right? Otherwise, the community kind of stagnates. And governance always involves decisions. So if you've done political science coursework anytime in the last probably 8 decades or so, you've encountered a definition like this, right? Where politics and governance involve questions of who gets what, when, and how, right? The essence of politics, or what we study in political science, is effectively decision making about how things are to be allocated within a community or a society of any size. And that's no different when you have something that we think of as a community, something smaller, close-knit, where everyone's living and working in close quarters. Decisions usually entail interests, and those interests are not all aligned. And so often there's conflict. And that conflict may not play out in very explicit or violent or aggressive ways, and yet it's there, right? And when decisions need to be made, those conflicts can come to the fore. Those interests can become salient. And so what I think is really interesting about community governance, especially at the level of something as small as a college like Wabash, is that on the one hand, we have this shared interest, commonality, lots of involvement, lots of engagement. And yet, in any community of practically any size, you're going to have decisions that need to be made that are going to be decisive in some ways, that are going to lead to some conflict. And that's what in some ways makes communities really interesting to study. How do you balance kind of that close-knitness with, that's not really a word, but I'll use it, right? That close-knit quality with kind of the fact that communities are still made up of many different people who don't always share the same exact ideas about how the community should be run or what sorts of decisions should be made on its behalf. One word I may have missed, but I think I did not see come up in the chat, is this idea that we've been talking about a lot lately at the college, which is the idea of belonging. Right. And so got a sense of, well, communities are made up of people with shared or common interests. Well, at the heart of that is a community is made up of people who kind of sense in some way that they belong or that they should belong to the community. And the decisions that are made collectively for everyone there, or decisions that are made that affect people within the community, can also affect people's sense of belonging. And so part of my goal for this course was to use Wabash as sort of a lens through which we could kind of grapple with all these ideas and think about kind of, well, how are decisions made at all different levels and all sorts of different types of decisions here at Wabash? How do different interests get involved in those decisions? We often think of those different interests, different stakeholders get involved in those decisions. When there is conflict, how is that resolved? And when all is said and done, what does that do for the different members' sense of belonging in the community? So that was kind of my starting point for thinking about all this. And as I do in many of my classes, we started with just some cold open case studies, right? So let's just dive right in without introducing any actual concepts or jargon or anything. Let's just take some things that have happened and start to make sense of them in kind of a layman's way. And I chose 3 different episodes of decision making in the history of the governance of Wabash College. One was the early 1970s elimination of compulsory chapel. There's a delightful write-up of that in These Fleeting Years that I excerpted a bit, and we just worked with that on the very first day of class. This was kind of interesting because many of our students right now aren't thinking back to 1970 and how chapel talks were compulsory. Now they're kind of a nice thing to do, a nice thing to attend. You don't have to, and certainly the faculty don't really care if you go to chapel or not. And for the students to realize this was kind of a faculty decision that was influenced by students, but not run by them. And kind of grappling with what role should the faculty be playing in decisions that seem very co-curricular to students today. And what role should students be playing in decisions that, at least at the time, were fundamentally academic in nature. Was kind of a mind blow. We did that quickly on the first day of class and then moved right on from there into, I think, something the students expected to tackle in the course. And that was decisions as to the college's status as a non-co-ed institution. We looked at two decision moments, a century apart. So we looked at the 1890s and we looked at the early 1990s. That played out over a couple of years. Right, so 90, 91, 92. We looked at those, and it's interesting because the decision turns out the same way, but the story is so different, right? And the stakeholders and those kind of playing the most active role in trying to influence the trustees, who are the same decision makers in both cases, just such different ways at arriving at the same decision. I think the students were pretty shocked to learn that the students in the 1890s didn't really have much role in that process at all. That was very different from the 1990s, when students were very central to a year-long study process, got very involved in the decision. There was write-up after write-up in the Bachelor. We delved into that, and a nice class tradition that I had kind of planned for a little bit, but didn't realize the extent to which this would play out over the semester was we were joined for that discussion by Jason Hand, class of 94, who was able to bring kind of his personal experience as a student who was on one of those study committees to the room. He was able to talk about what it was like for him as a student at the time, but also how the politics that played out in that situation have had lasting impacts on his and others' relationships with each other and with the college. And so we really kind of started the course, full steam ahead. We just dived right into it. It was great. And after that, basically second day of class, when we had our first guest visitor, we probably had visitors in class more often than not. We'll see a few of them on the slides that will come. But that turned out to be a really great feature of the class. And while I had planned for some of them in writing the syllabus, many of those just took shape as the semester played out. So some of you may see yourself on screen as these slides come up. From that cold open, we started with kind of the first bookend of the class. And the class basically kind of tried both at the beginning, at the end. So we have kind of these two bookends. Why are we here? The second week of the semester, and Wabash in the world, pretty close to the last week of the semester, where we try to situate Wabash kind of geographically and historically beyond the campus itself. So most of the semester, we really focused on what goes on right here on the ground in this little corner of Crawfordsville. But we began and ended by trying to kind of situate Wabash in a bigger picture. And I think that was an important piece of the course, and I'll talk at the end about thoughts for moving forward with that. One way we did that was just to learn about the founding of the college and situate that in the kind of American historical context of Western expansion, Jacksonian democracy, the rise of missionary movements dedicated to promoting education on the frontier as the frontier moved further and further west. As part of that discussion, Beth Swift, who was the archivist at the time, joined us and gave us a presentation that I think has been kind of featured on this After the Bell series as well, on kind of the college's physical history, the history of the campus. And I thought one of the most interesting things she said along the way was this quote I put up on the screen, that Wabash was built to face outward, right? So its main entrance kind of faced the community. But then over time, as the campus developed, we've turned inward. I didn't know she was going to say that, but I think it set us up really well for that second bookend at the end of the course, thinking about Wabash College's relationship both to the local community and the larger world beyond. The class met in the Malcolm X Institute, and so kind of a second piece of our Why Are We Here discussion featured a visit from the director and associate director of the Malcolm X Institute, so Stephen Jones and Tim King, who joined us after watching a documentary about the history of the Malcolm X Institute to talk about its location and in its current building, the move as it happened about now a little over 20 years ago, and how that kind of affected different members of the community's sense of belonging and relationship to the Wabash community. So we started kind of with this situating Wabash geographically and historically, really by thinking about kind of the physical location of the campus. We ended the semester thinking more about Wabash in the world as it relates to the world outside of the campus. First, by thinking about town-gown relations here in Crawfordsville. We had Mayor Barton join us for that. And then thinking about Wabash's role in the international arena. And as you can see, we use this article from the Chronicle of Higher Education, thinking about colleges' foreign policies, especially as colleges do more and more with respect to study abroad, international partnerships, and how we manage that. So that was kind of the large framing of the course. Beyond that, we kind of approached the course in two halves. So the first half, leading up to spring break, focused on what we call institutional shared governance. And in the realm of higher ed, I know this term is used in other settings as well, but in higher education, when we say shared governance, we're thinking about kind of a system of sharing responsibility for administering a college among three partners. And does anyone know what they are? I guess those in higher ed probably have some sense of this. When we think of shared governance, who are the three legs of the stool? And you can put that in the chat as well. Yeah, there we go. All right.
There we go.
Yes.
Faculty and staff.
So it's faculty administrators, trustees. Though it's interesting, right, to come up with different possibilities. There are just three kind of in the classical model of shared governance. It's the trustees, the administration, and the faculty. And we basically spent a week devoted to each of these. Definitely see trustees kind of exclamation point in the chat. Yes. So we spent a week on each of these kind of three legs of institutional shared governance. We did this in different ways. As you can see in the picture at the bottom of the screen, President Feller came. He led a discussion of, we actually read about the presidency of President Hopkins. Was that like back in the 20s or so? He had a really interesting tenure. And President Feller led a really great conversation with the students about that. And we use that as a lens both into kind of what is the role of the president in governing the college, but then also to think more broadly about the concept of executive power and what good leadership entails. We spent a week on the trustees, and we met with trustee Jennifer Evans to talk about that role. We look both at the kind of historical role of the trustees and some of the recent work the trustees have been doing. And then the faculty is tricky. It's hard to find just one bring in. We did have a meeting with Dr. Melissa Butler, who joined us for a meeting right before spring break. But to really get kind of a fuller picture, each student interviewed a tenured faculty member at the college. You've got my tweet there after reading their homework assignments about that, and it was a pretty interesting conversation. They definitely got many different perspectives on the faculty's role in shared governance. I saw in the chat that some people mentioned students as one of the pieces of the shared governance puzzle. It's interesting, students aren't kind of formally part of shared governance. And we looked at kind of the classic statement from the American Association of University Professors on this. Probably won't be able to make out much of the font here. It's pretty small. It has a kind of almost like an appendix, like this little section at the end that talks about, well, where do students fit into all this? The students in my class, at least, were not very satisfied with this. They found it a bit patronizing. They found it a bit kind of not well thought out. And so I think they were relieved then when we turned in the second half of the semester to the topic of student self-governance and student activism. I said some of you might see yourselves here on the screen. And so John Pachter, there you are. And John Kersey as well. John joined us for a conversation about student activism. They talked especially about anti-Vietnam War protests in the 70s, but that discussion really broadened out for students to think about their role as activists within the student body nowadays. Other things we did in this unit, we talked about the gentleman's rule, and we used Dr. Butler's La Follette lecture from 1991 to guide us there. So we got a pretty good dose of political philosophy in that class. We did actually a comparative look at the student body constitution at Wabash. We looked at this student body constitution, and then each student got a different student body constitution from a liberal arts college. I selected them a little bit for kind of regional diversity, but really for the ones that were easiest to find in PDF form online. So we looked at 13 different constitutions. We looked at the Wabash Constitution and talked about similarities and differences. I'm pretty sure that some of the things student government has been doing or thinking about in terms of changes to small changes to the way student government works here grew a little bit out of that exercise. We also talked to Diane Madnan, class of 2020, who had been student government, student body president, kind of going into the COVID pandemic. And we talked to the class a bit about leadership then. And I think some of the biggest stuff we did in this half of the course actually came towards the very end, or kind of was woven in throughout. And that was in the students' final reflections, where they had to write an op-ed proposing some sort of change to the governance of the college. You can see some very early draft change proposals in the picture on the left. All semester long, they also built up to an archival research project where they worked in 4 teams to understand how things have developed over time with respect to 4 topics: campus unity, freshman indoctrination, though I don't think we call it that anymore, housing, dining, and parking, so basically just the logistics of daily life for students on campus, and student body finances. They worked on that, like I said, all semester long. We spent many class days in the archives working on that. And they produced podcasts, about 10 to 15 minute long, maybe 12 to 20 minute long podcasts based on their research. And you can see the link up here. I'll put it in the chat as we wrap up today, so you can go listen to these on your own. But that was basically the course. So what happens next? Well, next is, I think, a plan to teach it this coming spring of 2024. I have an opening in my schedule, and I think the history department would love an American history class this year. So I think we'll offer that, but we'll see. If I don't do it this spring, maybe in a year or 2 or 2, 3, I don't know, it'll happen again. It was a fun class, and I think the students learned a lot, and I definitely learned a lot from it. one thing I learned is there is just such a rich history of decision-making, conflict, community building, involvement, engagement of all kinds at the college. This could be, right, this could be like a whole bunch of different courses. And so you see this tweet here from kind of early in the semester when I stumbled onto this little snippet and said, wow, like I could see developing an entire course on just kind of the women of Wabash College, or the women's role in governing Wabash over the years. I don't think I want to do that. I think what I want to think about instead is really meeting the moment every time I teach the course. I kind of designed it thinking, well, I could teach it the same way every time, right? Like these are kind of perennially interesting decision points that I'm selecting. I learned very quickly that the particular moment I was teaching it in kind of shaped the class in particular ways. This was spring of 2022. You probably saw in many of the pictures people wearing masks. We were kind of at that point in the pandemic where sometimes we had to wear them and sometimes we didn't. The students who took this class had mostly been freshmen when the pandemic hit, and that had really kind of shaped their experience and their sense of being governed more than contributing to the governance of the college. And so as it played out over the semester, the course really kind of ended up kind of centering around that as a theme. I don't know that it would be the same in 2024. It's going to be a different group of students who've had very different experiences here and in their lives. And so I think one thing I need to think about moving forward with this course is really kind of tailoring it to the semester in which it's being taught and the students who are taking it at any particular moment. I think Miles' Law kind of played out a bit as well. I think I didn't anticipate some of what I got from the students in that class, in part because where you stand depends on where you sit. And I think where you stand also involves kind of what you think is important, what you think is pressing. And I think as a faculty member, I sometimes have a pretty different perception of things from students. And so I think really working with students to kind of find the themes that are going to be most resonant in any given semester is going to be really important going forward. And then the last thing is just thinking about this course as it relates to this idea we call the college bubble or the campus bubble. Right, which is this idea that when students come to a college campus, especially a residential one like this, their whole life becomes that campus, and they are basically closed off or not really paying attention to what's going on around them. Usually in political science and in other disciplines, we try to teach to burst the bubble, right? We try to take students as far away from the college bubble as possible. This course kind of runs in the opposite direction. It says, no, let's really embrace this bubble and say, let's learn about political science, let's learn about history, by really just kind of drilling into this community that we're in and not really looking very far beyond it most of the time. I think I want to play with that balance a little bit more the next time I teach the class. One thing that's come up in conversation with President Feller about it is the possibility of thinking about how the college's internal governance and administration is often affected by state and federal policies and laws that are being enacted, and how those pressures can sometimes lead to decisions that might not otherwise be made. And so that's an idea I'm toying with and want to think about for the future. Beyond that, I'm kind of open. I don't like doing the same thing twice exactly the same way because it never goes as well the second time. So I'm looking to change some things up. I can also run with the same basic organization. And so I think I'm going to stop talking at this point and hear your reactions and your ideas for this course moving forward.
Hello?
So if anyone wants to raise a hand, or you can put things in the chat, either way, it's fine. So I see a couple of questions in the chat. So is there anything similar at different colleges and universities? I don't know of another course quite like this one. I haven't looked that hard. It's kind of a hard course title to just search for syllabi for. I have a pretty good academic network on social media, and when I mentioned my plans to teach this course, the reactions I got were mostly, oh, that's an interesting idea, not, oh, I've taught a class like that. So I don't know of anything similar at other colleges or universities. I think it works in a particularly good way, or I think it works particularly well here at Wabash in a way that it might not at many schools, just because that sense of community here is so strong. It's one of the things I love about Wabash. I really feel that practically everyone here is on the same page about a lot of things. We're very mission centered. People do care about each other, and I came here from a bigger state university where I didn't feel that same true sense of community, even if the term community might have sometimes been used. And I think that sense of community is part of what makes a course like this effective here in a way that it might not be more broadly at other colleges and universities. My biggest surprise when I taught the course, so it's one I alluded to earlier, and that was, I don't think I had quite realized what the student experience of the pandemic had been. This kind of moment for many of my students, most of them were juniors that year, so they had been freshmen in 2019, 2020. I didn't realize kind of how like their entire college experience was so disrupted by this. Their freshman year was dominated by basically being told to stay home after spring break. And then their sophomore year was dominated by social distancing rules that made it possible for us to be in residence and in person here in a way that most other colleges and universities weren't able to pull off in 2021. But for the student experience of that was just so many rules about when they could be with other people and what they had to wear in different places and how far apart they had to be in classes. And day one of the course, right, that just kind of hit me in the face in a way that I didn't expect. And so the sense from students that like they were in an autocracy, right, where decisions were made, and if they didn't follow them, the whole college might shut down and go remote. That sense of being governed or being kind of subject to decision makers, I wasn't really ready for that. I adjusted, but it became something I talked to many of my guest speakers before they came in about. That was probably the biggest surprise, and one that really sensitized me to how different the faculty and student experience of some things can be. See a question that says, could I tell us about the students working in the archives? How does that experience enhance teaching and learning? So I'm an archival researcher, so I love every opportunity to bring students into the archives. I think there's something really special, not just about hearing about something that happened in the past, but actually seeing firsthand and touching firsthand artifacts of that event. And we started the students off in the archives with just kind of an icebreaker activity where they looked at historical admissions materials and looked at how those changed over time. And I think students who are kind of skeptical of spending that much time in the basement of the library were suddenly like, wow, like you can see right firsthand that the college was framing itself this way, something we would never say today, or something we still do. I think seeing that in the flesh, so to speak, really kind of drove things home for many students. I think some were very frustrated by the archival work. It is slow, it's a treasure hunt. If you just want, if you're used to Google, I put a keyword in and I get an immediate answer. Shifting to, well, I think it might be in this box of papers, and let's get the box and then go through it page by page. That can be really frustrating to some. I had some students who were like, the archives is now my favorite place on campus. And they were down there many more hours than they had to be working on this project and just looking into other things. I think it made a lot of the history we were looking at more real to them. And I think being able to use their findings in the archives to produce something very modern, a podcast, talking about how the college has developed over time. I think that was a useful experience for them as well. This was a cross-listed history course, and as a political scientist, I always worry, am I doing enough for the other discipline that I'm cross-listing my course with? And spending that much quality time in the archives, I think the history department was probably happy with that experience. Let's see, other questions here. Trustee-driven governed institution linked to administration versus faculty-driven institution linked with administration. It'd be great if you could clarify that question. I'm not sure I get what it's asking for. Have there been any takeaways from the course that the administration, faculty, trustees have used as a point of focus for improvements to current and future success of Wabash? That's a good question. I know the students definitely kind of played around with some things. I've heard there have been requests to bring back the junior fence, inspired by some things they found in the archives. I know some real critical thinking about how student government operates came out of the course. I don't know that the administration, faculty, or trustees have really, at least not explicitly, kind of built on the course in any way. Something to think about. I do wonder if some of the conversations people like President Feller had, for example, with the students may have driven home some thoughts or ideas about how we might do things differently. But it's an interesting question. I've thought a lot about, what have students done with this material? I don't know that my colleagues and I have done very much with it. And so I might have to push that forward in the future. To what extent do students now participate in things like admissions interviews and other processes of the school? That's a good question. Students get pretty involved in the admission process. I don't think in interviews, but more in hosting students when they come for admissions visit events, showing them around. We just had a bunch of events for incoming freshmen to start to onboard them into their course registration and whatnot. And the students who are here on campus in the summer have been very involved in that. I don't think students are involved very much in admissions decision making or in interviewing. The class fits 1 foot in poli-sci, 1 foot in history. I'm in the political science department, and my friend and colleague Rick Warner, he was chair of the history department at the time and really encouraged that cross-listing. He has taught a course, I think might have been called like Wabash in the World or Wabash in World History, where he really tried to kind of situate the history of Wabash College in the context of world historical events. And so he was a fan from the beginning. And so the course has fit in both political science and history. Oh, okay. At some institutions, the trustees govern the college through the administration. That was not my sense when I brought at Wabash. Rather, the faculty worked with administration to govern the college. I think there are some governing decisions that are clearly kind of faculty and administration, others that I think fall more clearly to the trustees and then are implemented by the administration and to some extent by the faculty. I would say there's kind of both going on, and there's a bit of a separate domains, and different shared governance partners play bigger or smaller roles in those different domains. Link you to the podcast. Yes. Let me see if I can get back to that. Yeah, so there's a request for the podcast link, and let me see if I can find it real quick. put that in there for you. So you can listen to all the podcasts right at that link there. I can also share a link to the syllabus. That'll take me another minute to find. And that's got, I think, a full listing of the guest speakers that we had, as well as it has the guest speakers and all the readings that we did. It doesn't have the handouts and stuff or things I pulled out of the bachelor, but it does have the longer pieces that the class read. Let me see if I can find that. Let's see, meanwhile, how was college governance different in the early 1900s? I think the faculty were more involved in governing things that I think we have ceded to others now, whether those are to kind of professional offices at the college, like admissions or advancement, or just to the administration and trustees. I would say that's one of the bigger differences that I think stand out to me. I think the student governance has changed very substantially. It's no longer as dominated by seniors as it used to be. I think there's more opportunity for kind of younger students to step into important student governing roles earlier on. So I think it's more inclusive in that way. Am I in the Goodrich room? It's a background that looks like the Goodrich room. I'm the secretary to the faculty, and when we were having remote meetings during COVID, this was the background I started using, and I've kind of stuck with it. So yes, it looks like I'm in the Goodrich room, but I'm not actually there. I'm in my office in Baxter. Yeah, so do students study previous co-ed debates and decisions? We studied two of them. And briefly, just kind of as a starting case study in the beginning of the semester, we looked at the co-ed decision that was made in the 1890s, and then the one that was made in 1992. And they definitely, the 1992 one shows the interaction influence of students, faculty, trustees for sure. The one from the 1890s actually shows a little bit more interaction and influence of leading citizens in the city of Crawfordsville. They were a major force in kind of the politics of the co-ed decision at the time. The 1970s also interesting, and yes, and that is one that I'm told I should take a close look at for the next time I teach this class. Yeah, we have 20 faculty members, no dean of students. We have a pretty elaborate dean structure now. It's not nearly as elaborate as many bigger schools, but even in the 10 or 12 years I've been here, it's developed some. And that developed, it seems, slowly over the course of the 20th century, right? At some point, there's a dean of the college. It looks like it's in like the 1950s when they start talking about a dean of students. That's a role that seems so central now, and 75 years ago it didn't exist. I think the faculty were mostly doing kind of what the dean of students office does now. So I'm just trying to find that syllabus for you all.
And Professor, if it's easier, if it's not easily accessible right now, you can send it to me and I can circulate it amongst attendees as well in an email tomorrow, if that's helpful.
Okay, yeah, I'll send it to you then.
Okay, great. Yep, I'll be emailing everyone anyway with a survey about tonight, so I'll include that.
Yeah. Do we study the role of the chapel, mandatory versus voluntary versus didn't exist at all? We mostly looked at the mandatory versus voluntary. We didn't really get into when it didn't exist at all. And again, this was a very quick case study that we looked at on just the first day of class. we really just looked at these fleeting years coverage of that decision in 1970. But it's something I think to maybe delve into a little more the next time around. Yeah, right. The 1970s is this really important turning point. And we kind of started with that, and it came up periodically in the course. And then I think when John and John joined us to talk about student activism towards the end of the semester, I think the students got a really good sense of just how vibrant student voice was in the 1970s, and how that was a break from the past at that time, and how it's kind of different from the way student voice plays out today as well. Any other thoughts or stuff I should definitely be thinking? Yes, they were definitely interested in seeing the draft card. That was a moment. Kind of like going down to the archives. I think seeing the actual draft card versus just hearing about people burning their draft cards, I think that was a moment that was like, oh, this history was super real, right? It's tangible. It's something, something we could touch. Yeah, World War II and the V-12 period. Yeah, that's one I've gotten kind of personally interested in. So while the students were doing their own archival research, I would sit there looking through the indexes of faculty meeting minutes. And things got pretty interesting faculty-wise during World War II, when many faculty, but also most administrators, went off to war and kind of left the faculty who remained to run the place. So I've been digging a bit more into that era, and I think, yeah, that's definitely a time period to take a closer look at the next time, or at some point in the future when I teach the course. So we have a question: was consideration regarding how governance of the community needs to fit within the framework of local, state, and national governments? That was pretty limited this time around. It came up in small ways. It came up a little bit in kind of this question of why the college was founded without a religious affiliation. And it may have come up a few other times along the way. That's one piece I'm really thinking about bringing up in a bigger way the next time around. Okay. 1970s, there was a change in curriculum requirements. Dean Trena, who drove that change and perhaps made the curriculum easier to manage. Yeah, it seems to me there's a, kind of a big change in the curriculum during the 20th century, kind of at, I don't know, 20 or 30-year intervals. There's one in the 20s, one in the 50s, and one in the 70s. I think that's one of those things that's interesting to me as a faculty member and less interesting to students, but definitely something to think about. The V-12 was something like the ROTC program during World War II. Yes, there is an interesting book on student life, 1967 to 1971, that can be bought at the Wabash bookstore. We used some excerpts from that book in the course, and I'm very glad that John Pachter compiled it for our use, and for it's an interesting book, a really interesting window into that time period. Is Wabash unique in its government, its model and culture, or is it similar to other schools? I think there are elements of both. Shared governance is a pretty universal, maybe not universal, but pretty widespread way colleges and universities are run in the United States. How shared governance plays out at different institutions varies a bit. I think one thing that is distinctive, if not quite unique, about Wabash is how much we do with still a pretty lean administrative structure. So we don't have a very built up kind of bureaucracy of administrative offices here at the college. Instead, I think we have a lot of people doing a lot of things, and without kind of bureaucratizing them really. It's really like I've been going through some old faculty minutes, and there are some things that really are very similar to the way they were in the 50s, for example. And I think there are ways in which we didn't move into certain kind of modernizing or professionalizing directions that other schools have. I don't know if it's fully unique, but definitely distinctive. Oh, that's an interesting framing. Is it fair to look at Wabash history through the lens of generational analysis? For example, how the baby boomer generation governed Wabash might be different from how Generation X governed. That's an interesting idea. I would, it's like a final exam question, maybe. Right? That would be an interesting one for students to think about, for sure. I think we were, in some ways, I think that day that we were looking at activism in the 70s, in some ways, kind of implicitly asked that question. I don't think the word boomer came out of anyone's mouth that day. But it's a good question, and definitely an interesting framing for at least parts of the course. Oh man, the questions are coming fast. Save it for oral comps. Yeah.
There's one from Kim King about the
Yeah.
MXI's current position.
Okay. How the MXI's current position played out in conversations of governance. Well, I think the Legacy of Hope documentary, which you can find on YouTube, was one of the first things we did in the course. And I think kind of really getting those firsthand perspectives on how the MXI came to be in its current location, and also how its role in college life evolved over the years, I think really hit students in pretty poignant ways. I think it definitely shook up their sense that things at the college have always been the way they are now, or that the way they are now is inevitable, right? And really kind of shook up their sense that the decisions that were made in the past had to be made in the way that they were. So I think that jumping into that really early on, I think really pushed the students to think about that. And to, I think about their own assumptions about how students from different ethnic, racial, cultural backgrounds feel about their membership in the Wabash community, their sense of belonging. I think that early class in the semester really, I think, kind of really pushed some critical thinking that was not necessarily happening immediately otherwise. And so it was a really good way to jumpstart that, and to really jumpstart and really boost students' critical thinking about what does it mean to belong to a community beyond just kind of officially being enrolled as a student, or officially being a faculty member in a place.
Right, Professor, I want to respect everyone's time. We've got 1 minute left and 3 questions from Bob, Tim, and Ross. So either you can pick one maybe, or do lightning round. It's up to you.
Do I see what's happening in Florida regarding higher education? Thoughts on impacts for Wabash going forward? As a private institution, I hope we're shielded from that. I haven't heard anything that gives me immediate concern here at Wabash, but definitely what's been happening at in the state of Florida, including, New College of Florida is a public institution, which is different, but it's another kind of small liberal arts college that I think fiercely guards its academic freedom, and seeing that happen there, I think definitely is frightening for faculty in conservative states, but I have not been feeling kind of an immediate sense of dread. Did that use the time, or
no? Go ahead.
Okay. alumni body feel they are one of the legs of college governance. Do I think the alumni body has more influence than other places? Probably more than other places. That's probably a piece of the puzzle that we didn't get into nearly as much as we could have in the class. I think the students saw alumni come up in interesting ways in different decision-making episodes that we looked at. We didn't look at them very systematically, but I do think the alumni at Wabash kind of speak a bit louder than alumni at other institutions, at least the ones I've had experiences with. And do I expect to publish anything? I have not already published. Expect to publish anything based on my archival research in the future? Maybe. This stuff I've been kind of very slowly digging into about kind of how things happened, played out for the faculty during World War II. I've been very interested in the impact of war on women at the college. And so I could see maybe some years down the line publishing something based on that. I'm not sure what yet, but yeah, it's a possibility. All right, I think that was it.
All right, well, cool. Thank you, Professor Gelbman. This has been wonderful and really insightful. Thank you as well to everyone who joined us tonight. I hope to see some of you again at our next Whenever, Wherever Wabash event, which is a Wally's Bookshelf event on Wednesday, July 19th. We will be joined by Dr. Peter Mikek, and we'll discuss the novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. So even though that's a month away, we are still advertising it now, so folks have a chance to read the book. And I know Wabash's library has a copy or two, so hope that makes that easy on you. But again, Dr. Gelbman, thank you so much for joining us. I will circulate the syllabus tomorrow or later this week, whenever Professor and I can get together, as well as a survey about what you thought about tonight and our online events like this in general. And the link to this video will be up on YouTube as soon as I get it there. So I'll circulate that as well. I know there were a lot of folks who will want to rewatch or couldn't join us tonight. So again, thank you all very much for joining us, and big thanks to Dr. Gelbman.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.